who serves as the Senior Director of Program Development for Living Water International. And he is based in the Texas area, but Living Water has operations all around the world. And so I'm excited for him to share some of the ways that they've tried to incorporate processes to engage local faith actors in understanding the impact of the work. So Nathan, over to you.
Great, thanks Dan, and good morning everyone. Excited to have a chance to present here. Let me get the screen share set up. Just 1 second. Let me know. Can you see that all right? Perfect. Well, great. So I want to talk kind of broadly about how, as an organization, Living Water is using most significant change as a tool for monitoring and evaluation. And it's something we've rolled out in the last couple years, but it's also a way for us to try and connect with local faith actors, local church leaders, more specifically, to involve them in this M&E process. And so, our hope is that it's in doing that it would be a helpful tool, a helpful approach for these local faith actors to be using, just in and of itself, but also thinking about how that can allow these stories, allow this data and information really in a systematic way to enter into the kind of the information system, if you will, of the organization more broadly, so that it informs our programming. And so I'll get into some more details on that, and I'm going to try and keep this relatively short because I would love to solicit ideas and suggestions for how we can improve this. But first, it'd probably be helpful just to give you some more background and context into Living Water, how we go about working with local faith actors and what that looks like programmatically. I'll also give a little bit of background on most significant change, but I was curious if you can maybe just put into the chat whether or not you've heard of MSC before, most significant change, or perhaps you've used it, or if you've never heard of it. That'll help me kind of know how deep to go on that part of it. But yeah, so starting out, so Living Water, we are a Christian organization focused on WASH, so water access, sanitation, and hygiene. Another way to kind of say that is that, so that we focus on mobilizing churches and communities through WASH interventions to increase the holistic well-being of the most vulnerable in communities around the world. So that kind of summarizes our general programmatic approach there. Just some background and kind of seeing where we work, but we've been around, this is our 30-year anniversary actually, and we currently work in 18 countries, have done over 21,000 water projects, impacting over 6 million people, just to give a sense of our history there. And then today, kind of our core programmatic approach, and this is helpful so you kind of understand the context in which our M&E work is occurring. It's what we call the WASH program area. And so we started this, I think in 2012, as a new idea of saying we want to take a more programmatic approach as an organization and have a focus in a specific geographic area. And so we've, over the years, kind of have tried some different options in terms of what that population size might be. Currently, we're landing on about 70,000 people would be an average size of a WASH program area for us. And during that time period, we're implementing integrated WASH programs. And we'd have a set of targets on some indicators that we're trying to achieve on some, water service access, those types of indicators to know when we could start to phase out of this specific program area. So you can see kind of those 5 red circles there, talking about what we would do, but number 1 and number 2 being church mobilization and then community mobilization. And then 3 and 4 being more of and 5 being more of the standard WASH interventions as far as providing water services or doing hygiene and sanitation promotion overall. So let me dig a little bit deeper though on 1 and 2. So church and community mobilization. And this is how we start to engage with faith leaders, specifically church leaders, primarily. The tool that we developed in 2017 and 2018 is called Flourish. So this is our model and approach that we developed for mobilizing churches and communities for what we call WASH-focused transformation. And we partnered with Tear Fund UK during those years to help develop this, building on their decades of experience with church and community mobilization. And currently we're operationalizing this, if you will, throughout our countries, still through our country operations, and trying to learn more about it as we go. And so within this, let me just mention here, so if you're curious, you can go, we have a web page up, which is just flourish.guide, and took a screenshot here, but we did develop some COVID-19 specific resources, but below that is our standard guides. But just to break it down structurally, so kind of what the approach we talk about within Flourish is that, so Living Water, we would have our church and community mobilization, our CCM staff, as we call it. So we'd have a coordinator, and then we also have some facilitators on staff as well. And they would be working directly to train and mobilize a set of facilitators at the community level. And then they would work, these facilitators would work with the churches within the community. So 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever that number might be, trying to work with these churches. And then the idea as well would be that each church would then form what we would call a church mobilization group. So a subset of the members of that church who are interested in engaging on WASH issues in their community. And for this engagement, so when the facilitator is working with the churches, we kind of have what we call 3 stages of Flourish here. So just to give you a sense, so first step would be envisioning and equipping. So having what we would call envisioning workshops, an opportunity for both the local churches and then our facilitators to be sharing their vision around development within their communities, and then equipping them with some resources so that in stage 2, there would be more church and community coordination. And sometimes this is already pretty well established. In other cases, it would not be, but this might look like encouraging some of the members of the church mobilization group to become engaged in a water committee, for instance, or just other ways to help be a part and engaged in the community development work. And then stage 3 is planning and taking action for WASH. And this is initially focused on WASH interventions, though hopefully what's being established here in terms of helping to mobilize churches, helping them coordinate with communities and obviously being a part of the community, but maybe there's some structures established, some trust built that can lead to other areas of development beyond WASH. But since we are a WASH organization, it makes sense for us to start there. And then within this, we identify, as we kind of think back to the structure of the different roles, we also identify specifically roles for MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So the first role we identify would be kind of what we consider more of a program manager type role within Living Water. So that could be the CCM coordinator, or perhaps our M&E officer, or even a program manager at the country office level. and they have a longer list, but that would include reviewing our monitoring data, helping to facilitate the most significant change process, our program evaluations, et cetera. And then training our CCM facilitators on M&E. So as we think about our CCM facilitators, and these are the ones that are working in the community with individual churches, they would be collecting data for monitoring as part of their role. They would participate in our most significant change process, and then sharing learnings, and then also training churches and these church mobilization groups on how to conduct their own M&E. And as we think about a church leader, so this could be a local pastor, this could also be some of the members of this church mobilization group. We're just primarily encouraging two aspects of M&E. The first being keeping good records, and then second being collecting stories of significant change. And so just a couple screenshots from our guide, but just some examples of how a local church leader could simply keep good records to help them keep an understanding of what activities have been happening and to learn from that process. But then also collecting stories of significant change. And if you're not familiar, here's a couple basic questions from that we encourage to be asked. So this would be in conversation with others in the church or others in the community. The main question would be, from your point of view, what has been the most important change in your life in the past couple months? And then you encourage them to tell you that story. You would ask, why was that story important to you? And then how did this change happen? And so trying to think through what led to that change more specifically. So that's kind of where we start to intersect some of what we're encouraging the church leader to be doing for their own M&E, for their own learning, with that becoming part of a larger system that we would have organizationally, so that information can start to work its way into our own understanding collectively. So let me take a quick second here to see if anybody put anything in the chat about what their experience has been. So a couple people familiar with it, but maybe a refresher would be good. So yeah, so let me just kind of quickly walk through this. So this is a technique that was developed, I don't know when it started, but a guide, I think the first guide came out in 2005 by Rick Davies and Jess Dart, with funding from quite a few different organizations you can see at the bottom of this. But this is the main guide, I think, that's still out there. There might be, it's been a couple of years since I've looked, but if there's anything updated, but this was the one that we built our processes off of. It's really thorough, about 100-page guide here. And I just pulled out a couple quotes from this just to walk through it. So the most significant change technique is a form of participatory monitoring and evaluation. And so it's participatory because many project stakeholders are involved both in deciding the source of change to be recorded and in analyzing the data. It's a form of monitoring because it occurs throughout the program cycle. And then it contributes to evaluation because it provides data on impact and outcomes. So it's considered participatory M&E. And then about the process, so essentially the process involves the collection of these significant change stories, and then the systematic selection of the most significant of these stories by panels of staff. And I would say the designated staff are initially involved by searching for project impact. And once these changes have been captured, various people sit down together, read the stories aloud, and have regular and often in-depth discussions about the value of these reported changes. When the technique is implemented successfully, whole teams of people begin to focus their attention on program impact. And so it's not just simply the collection of stories. Really, I think that the thing that separates this from some other methods or qualitative semi-structured interview processes and things like that is the process around the selection and bringing staff members together to discuss and sometimes debate what they would say is the most important change and why. So the basic process, again, is you would collect stories of change, you review those stories and select the most significant. Along the way, you are documenting the reasons for that choice so that that information can also be shared with others. And then you are feeding back results to those who were collecting the stories or who were sharing the stories as well. So just to kind of give a diagram that we use in our context. So there are essentially these selection processes occurring at 3 levels: at a country level, at a regional level, and then at a global level for us. And so if you start on the left, what we're saying is that through community interviews, there would be 5 stories that then get submitted to the country level. So a country office would form a team to review this. And we do this once a quarter, that there would be a review process. They would select 1 story, and that story would then go on to our regional service team. But part of the process is feeding back. So for each story, they're providing feedback. Sorry for the background noise. They're providing feedback into to those who are collecting the stories and telling the stories. So it goes to the country, to the region. The region then would have multiple stories. They would go through the same selection process, the same feedback process. And then we have a global team that's reviewing stories from each of our regional offices as well. And I've gotten to participate in each of these, and it, in terms of learning, I would say it's one of the most valuable processes we have currently, just to spend time with colleagues, getting to dig into levels of discussion on programmatic impact, or why, it's interesting to think about how this kind of change happened, because we were talking about this in this guide we developed or things like that. It's a really meaningful time of learning overall. So it's something we found valuable. Here's an example of a review process. This was with our Africa regional team as they were reviewing, and as an example, on the screen of what a story might look like, but it's a fairly interactive process. There's voting involved, and quite a bit of discussion, and sometimes some good debate. So just to wrap up, and then want to get your thoughts and questions as far as current status. So we have rolled this out globally now. So most of our countries and all regions are currently participating in this process. We are, we're currently solidifying, as it kind of thinking back to Flourish and how we would engage with church leaders, trying to better understand and how we would involve the church leaders into the process with the story collection, and what that might look like in terms of some of the review process for that. As you can see here, I just want to show you real quickly how we're kind of processing a lot of this. So currently we have about 250 total stories that have come in, and we have a database, which is just an Excel spreadsheet, but to where we are capturing some of the core data from the story, but also some metadata. So that could be helpful for us as we would come back and do some maybe more in-depth qualitative analysis at some point. But for instance, starting to try and capture the gender of the story collector and the gender of the storyteller, so that we can think through some power dynamic aspects of this as well over time. But that's kind of how we're collecting it and where we're at currently. So some of the challenges as we think about what it might look like to have these church leaders that we're working with to collect the actual stories of significant change. I was just in communication with some of our regional teams talking about this, and obviously getting written stories from local pastors can be a challenge. Noted some of with literacy levels, we don't know that it should be an expectation that there would be some of the local church leaders we're working with sitting down and writing up the stories in the same way we would expect it from our staff. So trying to figure that aspect out. I think there's been a lack of trainings. And again, that's what we're working through currently is some of the training aspects of this. Another thing that was noted, and I think this is, again, kind of coming from our staff, because as our staff are collecting these stories, they usually might have a camera or audio recorders, things like that. So they identified that if a local leader doesn't have this, it might be difficult for them. One thing that I've noted, and this is more, I think, with our own staff, but when you talk about stories, I think the initial idea is that these are marketing stories. And so this is a fundraising tool or marketing tool. So we've had to try and overcome that perception and really emphasize that this is an M&E technique. This is a learning tool for us and a listening tool. And then, of course, COVID-19 has impacted our ability to move around and not going into communities and things like that has interrupted the process recently. So again, I think, as at a high level, as I think about this, one of the things is trying to balance that tension of wanting these local faith leaders, these local pastors, local church leaders to really be engaged and using a method like this, asking these questions. These are really great questions, we believe, to be asking those around you to understand what's going on in other people's lives and learning in that way. But we're trying to also be realistic about what's possible. We're trying to not make local church leaders into NGO workers in terms of what their requirements might be. And so kind of balancing that tension of how do we effectively integrate this into this larger system that we have around most significant change, and yet not place an excess burden on the local faith leaders. So that's where we're at, and would love ideas and suggestions that you might have. So Dan, I don't know if you want to facilitate any Q&A or?
Yeah, thanks Nathan for sharing, and just really interesting to get a deep dive on the most significant change process and seeing how that's been applied. I'll get us started with the question, and then if there are others that have questions or stories of their own experience with this process, we would really love for that engagement. Nathan, one of the tensions that you mentioned that I really appreciated when you get into a qualitative storytelling approach to understanding impact, that tension of, is this about fundraising and telling the story to supporters, or is this about learning and program improvement? And what are the ways that Living Water has sought to demonstrate or seen this tool used as a means of learning and program improvement?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, some of it's just continually re-emphasizing the purpose of it. And so each quarter when we would go through the final global review and have a selection of what we consider our global most significant change story, we send out an email to the entire organization with the story, but also reminding people what most significant change is, what the purpose is of it, that is for learning, and that, when we say most significant, we're not talking, that doesn't mean like it's the best written story, or it's the most appealing from a marketing perspective. It just means that the review team thought the change documented in this story was important for some particular reason, and then we try and explain what that reason was. So I think that constant communication in our training processes, when rolling this out, when we're doing individual training with regions or countries, I'm just trying to hit that point really hard. But again, I think it's still a process, and there's a lot of ingrained history that is sometimes still challenging to overcome.
Hi, everybody. I have a question. So I'm Max Meduna, M&E officer here at the International Dialogue Center. Thank you very much for that presentation. I was myself not too familiar with the MSc techniques, so I was happy to learn about that. My question would be, how do you, in terms of evidence-based demonstrating of your results and impact, how do you balance most significant change, both internally in terms of weighing the breadth and depth of the change that the story tells based on the account of essentially one storyteller, also with traditional M&E methods, indicator-based monitoring and so on? Thank you.
That's a great question. Really important question too. So the way it's talked about from those who created this, and the way we approach it too, is that this would be a complementary technique to whatever the more standard M&E techniques that you would have as an organization. And so that's the way we approach it as well. So, we would have our normal monitoring of our activities and outputs. And then for our programs, we also have evaluations with a set of indicators and data that we're collecting quantitatively as well. So it really is just a complement, and in no way are we trying to use individual stories to help us kind of develop or prove an evidence base in any way. But I would say this, I think as we rolled this out around the same time we were rolling out a new theory of change. And, as part of that process, there are certain outcomes or results that, we just realize there's not actually great, validated quantitative indicators that we can use in our evaluations. And so this is a way to help us try and start to get an understanding perhaps of what type of change may or may not be happening in certain areas that we're really curious about, that we're still just at this point taking more of a qualitative approach to. So I think it can help kind of round out perhaps your understanding or your evidence around all aspects of your organization's theory of change. But I would not view it as a replacement for more standard M&E techniques.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for your presentation and sharing your experience. I'm Clemence, I work with WorldLeaf. So I just wanted to know, for any area of impact in your organization, how many stories do you require so that you can think maybe this opinion is being shared by many people, and then we can consider that the change is the change we desire is happening for many beneficiaries, not just maybe one person who benefited, but it doesn't represent the impact and the change that is happening in the community.
It's a good question. At this point, we haven't really, I would say established saying that we would need, as we look at our database of stories, so to speak, that we would need a certain threshold of, change in a certain area or on a certain outcome to place the emphasis on that, or to make a lot of decisions based on that. And again, it kind of goes back a little bit to what I was saying a second ago, but really the emphasis on this being kind of the learning and maybe understanding in a deeper way some of these aspects of our work that we may or may not be familiar with. And it's also, I think, another thing that has been really helpful and been interesting to see is that especially at the country office level, seeing the review process, allowing the review team to decide what change they would say is most significant and why, and documenting that. I remember in some of our trainings that, you know, some of a program manager we had from one of our country offices was asking, can you give us the criteria of what we should consider to be most significant? And what we had to really talk through was that, and actually a part of the process is you as a review team deciding that and telling us what you think is most significant. So there's no kind of top down, this is what you're looking for, or this is what you should consider most significant. It really is more of a bottom up process of hearing what is most significant to those on the review team and why. And so that's been kind of another mindset shift, you know, as we talked about, from marketing stories to learning, but also being extremely defined. We're looking to see how increased access to water has improved, you know, physical health for children. We're not saying it has to be that type of change we're talking about. We really want it to be completely open-ended and defined by those on the review team. Yeah, that's a good comment in the chat there. And one thing I didn't mention is that the changes can be positive or negative. And so there's no criteria that it's only supposed to be positive change stories recorded. I think sometimes the most helpful learning can also be from what the negative outcomes, the unintended outcomes could be as well. Although, again, and Rick Davies and Jeff Stark talk about this in their guide, their experience has been that over 90% of all the stories would be positive coming in, but really trying to place an emphasis and set the expectation that you can have negative stories of change and that's valued as well from a learning perspective. But again, when some of the mindset is that these are marketing stories and we want to look good and, you know, that sort of a thing, it can be a challenge, I think, to get there, but that's exactly right.
Maybe Nathan, if I can just briefly add on that last comment, have you looked into the humanitarian sector? There is this concept of AAP, accountability of affected populations, where basically the idea is to get the stories directly from the people that are affected by certain humanitarian initiatives to in turn improve the initiatives. I think there's a lot of parallel to MSC, the way you're implementing it.
Yep. No, that's a great point. That's a great point. I think another challenge for us that we're trying to work through and recently trying to address is, you know, in our guides, we do talk about having, you know, talking with a representative group of people within the community. And so not just focusing on church or community leaders in terms of who is telling the story, but really getting different voices, making sure that whoever would be the most vulnerable in that community has a voice and is telling their stories. And so, yeah, that's a great connection. I hadn't made that connection before.
Yeah, Nathan, one of the things that I could imagine being really valuable through this storytelling process is, you know, you think about the role or the impact of Living Waters intervention versus the other things in the community that are also having an impact, and trying to understand how they're working together and the kind of contribution versus attribution of change, right?
Right.
What is the role that Living Water is playing in a whole host of other changes that are happening in a person's life? And I imagine that this storytelling approach helps to discover some of that in a way that a more focused, indicator-based approach might not be able to uncover some of those other contributing factors because those tools are so focused.
Yep. Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think it kind of ties into the broader theme of it being more open-ended and undefined as far as what you're searching for. You're not really searching for anything in particular. You're just wanting to start just by listening. And so ideally that is the case, that, you know, we, in the interview process, it is 100% open-ended questions, and that someone would tell whatever to them has been the most important change in their life. And whether or not it's related to living water shouldn't matter in any way. But yeah, it can, I think, help us understand some of the other impacts, positive or negative, that we might not be aware of that living water is contributing to, but also understanding those aspects outside of living water as well, that are so impacting people's lives, obviously. So it's a good point.
Well, I would have another question if nobody else takes the floor. Again, this probably stems from my lack of familiarity with the methodology, but can you use that storytelling approach as well to capture less significant changes that you have achieved nonetheless?
Can you unpack that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
So you don't focus just on the single most significant change, but perhaps some less significant changes in beneficiaries' life that happened that can be attributed to the program's initiative, but is not the single most significant change.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the most, so when you add the most onto it, that's really coming from the review process and not necessarily the actual interview storytelling process. And so there's different ways to phrase the question and different approaches taken with it, but usually it's something around, can you tell me about an important change in your life? Or, and you think about translating to different languages, thinking through what the best words would be. But, I think you could keep it more open-ended to tell me about a change in your life, or, something to that effect. But then the most part gets added in the review process of saying, of these 5 stories we're looking at, what would be the most significant from our perspective. And really the point of that is to drive debate and discussion, because when you have to pick one, that's going to make people listen and actually be engaged and give their thoughts, rather than just, if it was an open review and you're trying to bring 5 of staff together who are extremely busy and say, let's take an hour and a half out of our day and sit down and read these 5 stories, and there's no other process around that, it would, I think, be a pretty boring meeting and probably not a lot of engagement. Just, oh, all these stories are great, or that's all interesting. Okay, let's move along. Whereas if you're having to decide, okay, what are we as a group going to say is the most significant of these and why, that drives more conversation and engagement, I think. So, but that's a good point. That's an interesting thing to think about.
All right, thanks for clarifying.
Great. We have time for perhaps one more question or additional suggestion or reflection before we wrap up. Who else has a burning question? All right. Well, hearing none, I should probably refine my facilitation. I found that asking for one last burning question often doesn't elicit one last burning question, but instead causes people to categorize their questions as whether or not they are important enough to submit them. But thank you, Nathan, again for sharing about this process. I've certainly learned more in hearing you share this process, and I'm grateful for the work that your team is doing and trying to capture the stories that are out there and learn from them. So thanks for sharing that experience with the Hub. So as we come to the end of our hour, just a reminder that as Stacy has mentioned at the beginning of the hour, that we are going to be sharing again the call for good cases. So consider for yourself any cases that of meal in participation with local faith actors. Any cases for yourself or your organization that be worth submitting, or organizations that you know have a good story to tell that you would recommend the hub spend some time capturing their stories and including those in the compendium. And also, please do mark your calendars. There will be a save the date being sent out shortly, but for the next hub meeting that will be in October. So looking forward to reconnecting with all of you then. So thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day to join on shorter notice, and look forward to connecting with you on October 14th. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.